Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today at this launch event for the FX Global Code. Thank you also to our friends at the ACI and at the Investment Association, our partners this evening, and especially large thanks to Linklaters for hosting us. For those who don't know me, my name is James Kemp, and I'm the Managing Director of the GFMA's Global FX Division. I also run AFME's Compliance and Technology and Operations divisions across Europe and sit on the FIC Market Standards Board. All of these have extensive overlap, as you'd expect, and have put me in a very privileged position when it comes to a project like the Global Code. Over the last few years, the industry has undergone huge and tremendous changes: a new regulatory landscape, a more robust prudential environment, and a much greater emphasis on culture and conduct. Altogether, this represents unprecedented transformation in a very short time frame. This transformation has required buy-in from the buy side, from central banks, from the sell side, from supervisors, regulators, infrastructure, all market participants, and from each firm across trading, operations, technology, compliance, and legal. The development of the FX Code, which has brought us here tonight, is why I'm pleased to see such a broad spectrum of attendees in the audience. The creation of the code has brought together leading figures from all parts of the industry who have all devoted many hours to debating, drafting, and refining the text, covering a wide range of issues. I would like to congratulate all of those involved on reaching this milestone. The Global FX Division has been a strong supporter of this initiative from the beginning. Several of our board members have been part of the Market Practitioners Group, and all our member firms have been involved through the various central bank committees. The same, I know, goes for the IA and the ACI, and I'm sure many other trade bodies who are here this evening. There is a real understanding, though, that this is a marathon, not a sprint. The size and diversity of the FX market means that getting the message out globally to the whole market is key. With that in mind, I'd like to introduce our panelists here this evening. They have been the key figures behind the code, and we look forward to hearing from them about how we've reached this point and what happens next. Guy Debelle, known to many of you, is the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia and Chair of the Global FX Committee. Simon Potter, to his right, is Head of Markets at the New York Federal Reserve Bank. Chris Salmon is Executive Director for Markets at the Bank of England. Adrian Bowler is Global Co-Head of FX, Local Markets and Commodity Derivatives at BNP Paribas, and is with us here today as one of the leading figures in what was the Market Practitioners Group. In terms of how we'll run this evening, the panel discussion will last for about 45 minutes, after which we'll have time for a few questions and answers with the audience. Then I hope you're able to stay for a drink and a chance to chat to the panelists and your fellow attendees. Two things before we start. Firstly, on health and safety, we're not expecting any testing of fire alarms, so if you hear one, please do follow the fire exits and any instructions or go to the main entrance. Secondly, in the UK, there is a small matter that the UK is heading to the polls on June the 8th. During this pre-election period, the Bank of England is in purdah. And as such, I'd like to just note that Chris Salmon will only be taking questions on the FX Global Code today. Questions on any other topic, difficult or otherwise, will have to wait for another day. And any difficult questions on the code, I guess, as well. Anyway, without that, we will move into the panel session. So many thanks, everyone, for joining us this evening. A few questions to kick us off. Everyone here should know about the Global Code. I'm sure they do. But it's probably just worth having a quick recap of the story so far, Guy, what it replaces, where we are, and how we got here.
Okay, so first of all, if you don't know where the code is, you can now find it on the newly launched today globalfxc.org website. So this is what it looks like, by the way, in hard copy form. But that's where you can find everything you need to know, is in a one-stop shop at the globalfxc.org website. So how did we get here? So as all of you know, the FX industry has faced a deficit of trust over the last few years as a result of various things that have been going on, and we as in the central banking community obviously care a lot about the foreign exchange market because it's a key part of the plumbing of the financial system and very relevant from our point of view as a transmission mechanism of monetary policy, and also we are all active participants, varying degrees of activity, but anyway, participants in the foreign exchange market, so it's something we care about. And going back a bit over 2 years now, it's recognised there was a need to try and address that deficit of trust and look to move the market to a better place. As a result, we were commissioned by the BIS governors to come up with the code of conduct and come up with ways to get people to actually adhere to the code of conduct. And so we put the band together, and it was very much, I think there are a couple of things to emphasise. It's very much a public-private exercise. So it was the central banks working with the private sector, with the market participants group, chaired by David, who very much apologises for not being here. He's on a plane back to the US, but a very able substitute in Adrian, who's also devoted a lot of time to this. So David's group of market participants, which was some 40-odd people from right across the market both globally and in terms of the structure of the market, spanning all segments. So central banks working together with that market participants group, we've drafted the code. We put the first phase out this time last year, and today it's the culmination of all of that with the complete version of the code, some 55 principles spanning all aspects of the market. Alongside that, the code we've put out today is we've put out our blueprint for adherence, which has a number of dimensions, which we can get to a bit later on. The other thing which we've announced, which has come into being as of today, is the Global Foreign Exchange Committee, which is a sort of newly constituted body of the Global Foreign Exchange Committees. So there have been 8 core FXCs involved in this sort of work for a while, but we've now broadened that to include a number of additional foreign exchange committees, most notably China, Mexico, Brazil, Korea, and late in the day, South Africa, thank you. So we've got that broader coverage of that, and with also India, Switzerland and Scandinavia in the room, all of whom are in the process of formalising their foreign exchange committees. So that body has now got ownership of this code. Its chair is actually Chris, not me, as of yesterday. So Chris is the chair with David as the vice chair of that group going forward. So that body is responsible for owning and maintaining this. We'll keep making sure this document stays current on a high frequency, on a regular basis. And this code, I think there are two important elements just to finish off. One, it is a single code, so it's replacing those existing codes which have been out there across the various markets. And secondly, it's a global code reflecting what I was just saying. It involves all the top 16 current FX trading centres in the world, 1 through 16. So its breadth is very much global.
Excellent. Well, thanks for that sort of overview. If we dive into the details, I suppose the first version of the code a year ago covered sort of ethics, information sharing, etc. What's the key focus this time around, Simon? Perhaps one for you. Where have we gone with this? Lots of more examples by the looks of things. Who wrote them? Who are they for?
So the phase 1 of the code that was released last year did cover 4 areas. The execution area was an area that we knew we had to build out from phase 1. Mm-hmm. So electronic execution, prime brokerage was a lot of the focus. We also wanted to get the governance part put up right. I think that is worth a read there. The ethics and governance sections are very important as a foundation to everything that follows. And people who are signing the code, I know a lot of you are looking through, checking when you can sign through. That ethics and governance is pretty critical in that sign-off. Now, the other part we had there was risk and compliance, which we built out. So the latter part of the code, risk and compliance and the settlement aspects, that was, I think, an area that we've made a lot of progress in the FX industry, and the FXC have made progress. What we were trying to do is make sure that this code was more dynamic and took on some of the issues that are top of mind to many of you. The electronic trading, and definitely the last look, which we'll, I'm sure, talk about a little bit more, was an area where we put a lot of focus and I think we made a good progress. Now, on the examples, this is something that in the original design of the code, we want to include a reasonable number of examples. Examples are hard to get just right. So we formed actually a work group to help us in the second stage, and a lot of effort went into trying to get the examples that would speak not just to traders, but to everyone in the industry. And as Guy tried to emphasize, this is not just for the sell side, this is for everyone. Mm-hmm. So when you're reading through, and if you go online to read through, you can click on a principle. If you do, it will take you to an example. We want people to think through those examples, and that will help them further understand what the underlying principle is behind the code. As Guy said earlier today, we want people to be thinking. This is not a checklist. This is for you to think how to support an FX market that is going to be robust, liquid, fair, and open to all participants.
And on those examples, from a market practitioner's point of view, do they make sense? Do people on the desk understand them? Can they work with them? Do they sort of clarify issues?
Yeah, I mean, that's the beauty of having the code more generally written by market practitioners. For market practitioners, it's real.
Yep.
Okay? It's written in language we should all easily understand. And the examples go the next step to really bring the principles and the practices to life, so we actually see what that looks like in our daily jobs, wherever we sit within the industry. Mm-hmm. Now, some of the examples are written with specific roles in mind, so there are references to traders and salespeople, and also with specific client segments mentioned, asset managers, hedge funds, so on and so forth. But it should be taken as read that they apply, or the spirit of the learning or the principle or practice that's being illustrated applies to all market participants and not just a particular role or the particular client segment that's being highlighted.
I think one thing which is worth mentioning is we actually road tested the examples.
Yep.
We road tested on our traders to make sure they could understand. I mean, and as did a number of the members of the market participants group, took them to the various people who had interface with the FX market, and their organisation said, "Okay, does this make sense to you?" And that was useful because in some cases they'd come back with questions which either meant refining the examples, or in some cases also writing the examples allowed us to see whether the principle was as well articulated as it could be, and if the examples didn't quite work for the principle, was sometimes the case that the principle needed to be adjusted as much as the example.
Okay.
But I just want to emphasize, everyone should be looking at those examples. They might not relate to your particular role, but it's very important for this code to work, that everyone understands different roles and responsibilities in the FX industry.
So coming back to you, Simon, there was something you mentioned, the topic of last look. So perhaps that has been one of the most controversial, not necessarily for this code, but of course going back to fair and effective markets in the UK, for example. We followed that debate, obviously, with interest. Two questions for you, and perhaps Guy come in on this as well. What does the word likely mean? And does it mean that last look is, pre-hedging in the last look window, it still is, as it were, alive and kicking?
So I'm not surprised to get this question. So we've, I think, been talking about this quite a lot. I think you want to step back and think about what we're trying to do. So we're trying to work together with the industry to help give guidance and apply best practices. And we want this to be in areas that are actually relevant right now. And clearly, last look is a really debated issue. How should it be appropriately used? And we spent a lot of time writing this principle. It's one of the longest principles in the execution section. And the first thing is, just ignore the trading in the last look window topic. Everyone should be reading through that principle. Last look is primarily there as a risk control mechanism. And it should be the case that people who are providing last look and people who are using it understand that, and understand how that particular provider is using it as a risk control mechanism. If we had that out there, I think that would go a long way to improve understanding of last look and whether people want to use last look or not. Then we thought hard about, this is an area where the incentives can be a problem. What's happening is in the way that if you take a strict definitive last look, there is an option that is being offered to the person providing that service to accept or reject that order. And we know where an option is not priced correctly, that can lead to problems. So we are very careful to articulate in the latter part of that principle what those problems can be. So for example, at the right start, when we're going through some of the issues after risk control, it is completely inappropriate to use last look to gather information with no intention to trade. Then, if there's a part of your algorithm that... Good timing. If there's a part of the algorithm or the way that you're executing last look where there's a belief that you can more efficiently execute it by doing some trading related to that trade request in the last look window, it has to get past two things. One is, what is it that you need to do given how recent that price is? Because you're basically giving to the market some information about someone's interest. Then, if you don't execute, if you reject after doing that, how can you get the client in a good position? It's very hard to do that. So those two things made us think that likely, but we can't be sure, in most instances, that trade in the last look window is probably not going to, on average, benefit the client. But we want to know across the whole industry if there are different ways of executing where the liquidity provided by this, particularly in strained market conditions, might allow it to get past those two barriers.
So actually probably jumping in with Chris there, because I think the next phase with the global code is to look at a consultation around this. So maybe Chris, you can come in on that.
Thank you, James. And I'd just like to reiterate, to start with everything Simon said about the length of the Principle 17th and the clarity of the guidance it provides about its role as a risk control mechanism. We did debate the issue around trading in the last look window extensively during the period, and the language in Principle 17 about likely inconsistent is the correct language for the principle, and that's where we ended up. But we did conclude as well this was one area where the newly formed Global Foreign Exchange Committee could play a role by initiating a more public consultation to try and get further information from the widest range of market participants about that particular aspect of last look. So if you go on the website that Guy mentioned earlier today, we have launched today as one of our first acts a consultation specifically on trading in the last look window. We ask two questions, one of which is related to that, and I read out the principle as it stands. During the last look window, trading activity utilises information from trades request, including any related hedging activity, is likely inconsistent with good market practice. So it may signal to other market participants or clients trading interests, skewing prices against the client, and is not likely to benefit the clients. We state the principle, and we're asking, do you agree or disagree? Or are there specific situations where trading activity could actually benefit the clients? If you think they are, let us know. Feedback that information. And then the second question is, based on your response to the first question, do you consider the language set out in the code on this activity should be modified, for example, strengthened or implicitly left as is? So we've kicked off this consultation. Mm-hmm. It runs to the 21st of September. We want people to send in their reactions, their feedback. People should do so anticipating any inputs to this process will be made public and attributed. And then the Global Foreign Exchange Committee will come together during the fourth quarter of this year, look at that feedback systematically and reach conclusions, which may be that the likely inconsistent language is completely appropriate or some modification is needed.
Okay, helpful. So I suppose what that sort of says to me is that generally, 55 principles or 54 principles seem to be
54 plus 70.
Yeah, so 54 principles were successfully discussed. We have one that was is still going into consultation. It's still going into consultation.
I don't think that's the right way of thinking of how best practices work. This document is going to evolve over time. So we reached a judgment with our knowledge and everyone's knowledge that this was the appropriate principle at the time. If we get more knowledge, we'll evolve that principle. This is as equal as any other principle. It's written clearly. Remember, these are guidelines, principles. It's not a rule book. We want everyone to look at this and understand what we said in there. And if you're on the buy side, you're receiving last look, find how it's provided. If it's provided in this particular way we trade in the last look window, try and understand whether that's to your benefit or not.
But to that point, though, James, any of those principles may, in principle, need to evolve in the future as the market changes, and it just happens to be the one which is in the most state of flux or debate at the moment, and hence and hence this process. But in 12 months' time, it may be something else which would be worthy of going through the same sort of process.
And in the market practitioners group, probably Adrian is best to answer this one, was there sort of fierce debate across the sort of the general principles, or was it a constructive process getting to this point?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, personally, I've been very, very impressed throughout the process, throughout the drafting, by the degree of engagement from market participants. Discussions have always been constructive, they've been respectful, opinions have been listened to, and they've been very inclusive. Okay, so yeah, there are other members of the MPG in the room, I'm sure they'd attest to that view too. A couple of important points to reiterate what Guy said before. The construct of the MPG is very, very important. Okay, it's not just the sell side representation on the MPG. There's a healthy cross section of all segments. So it's fair to say that all viewpoints were discussed. That's the first point. And secondly, the FXWG and the MPG received over 10,000 comments over the drafting, over the two drafting phases. And I can attest to the fact that the MPG went through every single one of those comments line by line, okay? Or the co-heads in some cases of the various different work streams. And I co-chaired the information sharing section in phase 1 and adherence in phase 2. So the industry's been given an opportunity to voice its opinion, and it has. Now, when it comes to forming consensus, particularly on some of the hottest topics, there has been a huge amount of debate, particularly on Principle 17, and we've had to settle, or the MPG felt it was appropriate to settle on one notch less granularity and prescriptiveness than perhaps some individuals or some individual market participants might have wanted for the greater good of the code. Now, what that doesn't prevent is individual market participants requesting or seeking a greater degree or a stricter degree of implementation or interpretation of a particular principle or practice in their bilateral discussions with their counterparties. And if nothing else, the code definitely gives a comprehensive framework for having those discussions.
And my conversations are exactly that, is that it's opened up the debate, the transparency, etc. And I think it gives a basis for discussions between counterparties in the marketplace on areas that perhaps didn't have enough clarity or disclosure. I mean, on that point, the code is very clear about increasing disclosure, increased transparency. Would you expect going forward, for Guy and Simon, would you expect to see it start to be incorporated into the disclosure statements that people have with their clients, these sort of public statements of disclosure?
Well, those statements should absolutely be consistent with the code. But I mean, I think we probably talk about the statement of commitment at some point shortly. But you want to be, you signed up to that statement of commitment that you're adhering to the code. Then any communication you have with your client should be very reflective of what we've got here. And so, absolutely, they should be aligned, because to be able to say that you're committed to the code and you're adhering to the code, any communication you're having with any of your counterparties should be completely consistent. And, easy way to be consistent is to use the same language.
So when you receive a disclosure statement, you should be reading through it and feel comfortable understanding that. Reading through the global code alongside with it will be helpful. And one of the things we want people to do is ask questions, so they understand exactly what services are being provided to them. And this is reasonably critical, I think. There is a responsibility of the buy side to do that. And the buy side has to be a very active participant in improving the FX market. If the buy side is just accepting the services, not asking questions, not thinking through it, then that's not going to help us achieve the goals of the code.
So it probably segues neatly into the sort of the adherence commitment statement that you mentioned. Probably from your side, Chris, given that you are chairing that group going forwards, the adherence, the blueprint that was published today probably gives us a useful place to start with how that process runs forward from here, and sort of a broader overview of how people sign up. Is there a commitment statement at a business level, at a country level, etc.? How does that blueprint run from here onwards?
Sure. So just stepping back a bit, I mean, the whole purpose of this exercise has been to develop a code of conduct which improves integrity of the market. And for that to happen, it has to be adopted by a wide range of market participants across a broad range of jurisdictions, whilst recognising this is not regulation, it is a voluntary code. So the blueprint that we published today set out the 4 tenets we think underpin steps towards widespread adherence. The first is the obvious one. The code itself needs to provide clear, relevant guidance which reflects good practice in the FX market, and the exercise we've been through over the past 2 years, which I think is unprecedented in its kind of depth and ambition to achieve that, leaves us in a situation where we are very confident the code published today meets that standard. Then the second tenet is it is the responsibility of market participants to take that code, to embed it into their systems and processes, into their firm, so they actually follow the principles, picking up on the point Simon and Guy have made, thinking carefully, what does the code mean for our business? And then we've developed, as an annex to the code, Annex 3, a short statement of commitment, which firms can use to demonstrate to their market participants that they have taken those steps and they are acting in a way which is consistent with the code. And what we hope is, through time, firms across all range of the market will choose to make those commitment statements and will start expecting that their counterparties have made those commitment statements, which goes back to Simon's point about the responsibility on the buy side to understand how their counterparties are acting. And if we can move to a world where there is an expectation that firms are following the code and demonstrating it, that will create confidence in the market that there's widespread adoption of the code. The third tenet is the central banks themselves will take leadership in trying to facilitate that process, and something which has been talked about at previous fora, but we've made it clear that we in our relations with counterparties will expect them to adhere to the code. We will adhere to the code in our own actions, and any foreign exchange committees that we help facilitate, we'll expect those members to sign a statement of commitment if they want to be on our foreign exchange committees, and that's true of London, it's true of New York, and it's true of the Australian committee. And then the final element is the job of the Global Foreign Exchange Committee that we've mentioned, will be to make sure the code stays up to date through time so we can make amendments as the market moves forward. So statement of commitment, which is very important, is an element in the blueprint that we have for adoption. And from a firm side, it's the bit that they can do by thinking about their behaviours and whether they are working in a way which is consistent with the code.
So I'll probably bring in a couple of questions sort of in overview here, and then perhaps one from a practical, what it feels like on the practitioner's side. I mean, Guy, and I guess going forward to you, Chris, are there plans to audit that firms have signed up or signed, or is there a central reservation or a place that people will record that? What are the plans for how will people know if firms have signed up to the code? Is there sort of a gold, silver?
Sorry, you go, Chris.
No, you go.
I was going to say, I mean, I think it comes to the point, if you can provide that, I think it'll be interesting to see how the market evolves in terms of requiring the sort of thing that you're, or expecting the sort of thing you're talking about, whether they will say, well, that's nice that you've signed that statement of commitment. Can you demonstrate to me that you're doing what you're saying?
Yeah.
And my sense from talking to a number of people is there's some likelihood that may come to pass. We're not requiring that.
Yeah.
I think but if the market moves in that direction, I think that's certainly a possibility. The other point we are talking about, which I may leave to Chris, is around a public register of those who have signed a statement of commitment and having a way of being able to access that, which I might let Chris talk about.
Thank you, Guy. Yes, so in terms of the steps that the Global Foreign Exchange Committee thinks it can take as a public-private partnership, we've come to the conclusion that we can and should facilitate the creation of registers where people can collect the statements of commitments that they have made. So there's an easily searchable place where people can go and see which firms have signed a statement of commitment which is relevant for the market segment they're working in. So I think sometime in the next month or two, the Global FXC will publish some principles or guidelines about what a public register might look like, what sensible characteristics of a public register might be. And from speaking to various associations and infrastructure providers, we're pretty confident there are organisations out there who want to establish public registers, and I would be highly confident before the end of this year, and quite possibly well before the end of this year, public registers will be established whereby firms can post their statements of commitment. So it gets easier for market participants to see who has signed a statement of commitment. And then what the Global FXC will do is we will create a global index of registers, given that this is a large disaggregated market across the globe. So if you want to understand which registers exist, you can go to the Global FXC website and from there go to the register most relevant for you. Just on your comment about auditing, that's not something that we have mandated. I think for some market segments, players may well conclude that they want to go and get some form of third-party perspective, either for their own purposes or in order to be able to demonstrate to their counterparties. And Adrian may pick up on this, but if you think about the FCA remediation process, I think that was a similar, there's some echoes there where firms actually found it helpful to get third-party inputs as they went through that process. But that's not something we have mandated from this ourselves.
Okay. And with that in mind, more from an MPG, talking about how people might be moving it forward, what are sort of the range of options that people have?
Well, I mean, as Chris mentioned, it's going to be down to every single individual market participant to interpret that in the context of their own business, because it has to be proportionate. How a large sell-side market participant adheres versus how a less frequent or more casual user of the foreign exchange market adheres are going to be very different. And in both cases, they're very kind of personal journeys. So the reality is that the adherence work stream of the MPG was acutely conscious of making sure that on the one hand, we had a credible adherence framework, and yet on the other, that we captured the largest possible audience of market participants. And we're happy that we've settled on language in the statement of commitment that strikes that balance for sure. Now it's going to be down to each individual market participant to look at the code, get into the weeds and see how the principles apply to their own business, and then choose the best way forward to adhere. Now, for large sell-side market participants, I think the feedback suggests that one of the challenges is knowing which entity should sign, because large sell-side market participants or complex financial institutions, and that will apply to some of the larger buy-side firms as well, have foreign exchange activity warehoused in various different entities. So is it one statement of commitment, or is it possibly a few to reflect the different activities under the umbrella of the group?
And could it be any of the above, as it were, in terms of?
Yeah, I think the MPG in the discussions that we had was quite comfortable that was wholly acceptable as a function of the individual market.
Consistent with the lead principle on governance, which you'd have to read through and make sure you were following that. Yes. Yeah.
So, but common to all market participants, and this really resonated on the MPG, is irrespective of the size, shape, and colour of your business. Chris's point about making sure you understand how to embed the code into your practices, whatever they may be, whatever the scale of your business may be, and being able to monitor them on an ongoing basis, and in due course demonstrate ongoing adherence. That's important, irrespective of the size and scale of your business. That's one of the underpinning tenets of adherence.
Yeah, very helpful. I suppose we're in London tonight, and we have the FCA in London, one of the largest FX market. How does it fit, Chris, with the senior managers regime? The statement this morning from the FCA talking about taking it into account as part of their regime. Does it mean there's effectively regulation of this code in the UK but nowhere else? How does that fit? What is the sort of the UK position?
No, the code is not regulation in the UK. It's not regulation anywhere. But I think the FCA has been consistent for over a year now that they see the code as providing relevant guidance about what good market practice is in foreign exchange market, and I think it's correct that they have reached that conclusion. And if you go and look at the senior managers regime and you think about evidence the FCA looks for to see whether senior managers are fulfilling their responsibilities, it does talk about ensuring that firms follow generally accepted market standards. And so the code is an input which enables the FCA to consider how senior managers fulfill those responsibilities. And they've been fairly clear about that for over a year. And I think all SMRs in the UK who are overseen by FCA or PRA should anticipate that that's one of the factors that they will look at when they're considering SMR performance. One of our challenges has been to develop a single code which can work in many different jurisdictions. And so in that sense, we have been agnostic about how market supervisors, securities regulators in different jurisdictions will choose to take account of the code in their in their jurisdiction. So in Australia, and Guy can talk to this, the relevant supervisor will take account of the code. The Chinese made perfectly clear at the Global Foreign Exchange Committee meeting yesterday that they will take account of it as well in their jurisdiction. So it will vary, and in other jurisdictions there'll probably be less direct reference to the code, but that's a jurisdiction by jurisdiction conclusion.
Do you think that perhaps looking at you, Simon, US markets, for example, where does it sit there? Are there teeth outside of the UK for the code? We've heard from Australia, we've heard China, etc. What about in the US, for example?
So, as Chris pointed out, this is not regulation. It's a voluntary code. And we use best practices a lot in the US. They've been very successful for us. And I view this as being a supplement to the regulatory and supervisory regime we have in the US. Now, the teeth for us in best practices, particularly in the Treasury market, have been the relationship the New York Fed has with its counterparties. The central banks were pretty clear today in the statement that they issued from the BIS that we will be committing and adhering to the code. We expect our counterparties to. I view that as having some teeth for a segment of the market. Yeah. In addition, and in New York, we're very strict on this with our best practice groups that we put together. We expect all the members of those to be adherent to the code, and that means their firm is adherent to the code. We found that to be a very effective supplement to regulation and supervision.
So that's obviously captures in the main, as you say, one segment of the market. How do we get the message out to the broader market, I suppose?
So the membership of our FXC is very diverse. And we have hedge funds, we have platforms, we have high-frequency firms. So that's one way that we will get it out.
Yeah.
I think events like this are another way of getting that out. And once you have a significant mass of people who are following the code, I think the market itself will enforce some discipline there. And that's something that we all expect to happen. We believe the code is going to prove useful to people. It will reestablish some of the trust and integrity, not only amongst the public, but of the people in the wholesale market themselves. And the people who've worked with us on the code, like Adrian, these are people who are really dedicated to the FX market. The vast majority of people work in FX are trying to do that. So we should view this as a positive step. Here's a set of principles to think about in the business and the market as a whole. And I'm very positively viewing this as being added progress in that way. But there's no way that this code or regulation or any other thing will prevent a single person or a group of people getting together and committing some kind of bad behavior or violating law or regulation or exploiting some loophole. What we want is for the industry as a whole to be more aware, up to date, of where that might be coming, so they can call that out as soon as possible.
So just let me add one thing, which is to your question, James, which is over the last little while, we've engaged with around 120 industry associations right around the globe, so decent whack. And so in getting the message out there and utilising them, which and generally all been willing to get the message out to their members. And so, that we are going to avail ourselves of those sort of opportunities wherever possible to get that message out as broadly as we can.
And do you have a concern, which is some of the noises we heard perhaps in the early phases, that was mostly aimed at sell side and sort of ensuring that the relevance of it to the buy side is there, and that the examples and certain parts of it apply, across markets, some apply to various segments? Are you happy that message is getting out, or how do we improve?
Well, I keep on saying it. That doesn't mean it gets heard, but I don't think I'm banging my head against a brick wall. But I think one of the points that I make around this is that and there's a point. So I've made this point to the corporate treasurers in Australia. So they have a more sporadic engagement with the market, and we make it very clear in the code that the proportionality matters, and Adrian mentioned this earlier, that it really depends on the nature of your engagement in the market as to how much it's directly relevant to your own operations. However, what is useful if I'm a corporate treasurer is I can pick this up, I can read it, I think it's pretty readable actually, so I can actually read it, and then I can say, okay, this is the sort of expectation I should have of my counterparty in my somewhat sporadic engagement with the market. So the relevance to them is as much I'm not sure how-to guide, but a guidebook as to what the expectations I should be having, holding my counterparty to. It's not going to have so much direct relevance to their own operations. It's more, this is what I should be expecting from my counterparty. And so I think the use to some of those segments of the market is very much that, rather than requiring some realignment of their own operations. This is what I should be expecting when I'm interfacing with the foreign exchange market. And that's really where the value is to some of those segments of the market. And that is the message to try and get across.
My sense, James, to go to your question, is that depth of awareness and engagement with the code outside of the core sell-side firms has and continues to grow. So when I think of doing events like this, March of last year, I would say that awareness levels outside of the core sell-side was a lot lower than when I was doing events around this March. And I think it is growing. It probably still needs to continue to grow, but I think the arguments that Guy and we have been making have had an impact, and people do understand it. And fundamentally, the code is a tool for all market participants, and that's what we have to keep saying and keep reiterating. But my sense is that message is being heard more and being more accepted than it was 18 months ago. So in that sense, I have some confidence.
And I think on that particular point, to Chris's point about awareness rising, if you track the pattern of feedback over phase 1 and phase 2, we had 4,000 comments in phase 1, we had 6,000 in phase 2, and okay, maybe we can argue that some of that increment is because of last look and the contentiousness of last look in the second phase, but we had agency versus principal in phase 1 as well, which wasn't a small discussion either. So I think
is that one sold?
so I think that clearly shows that awareness and a desire to kind of participate in the discussion is improving.
So that leads neatly into the next question I have, which is, you're obviously working with clients day to day, and I know you're here for the MPG as the whole market, not as on the sell side. Can you already point to positive impacts, or what other positive impacts are you witnessing from the market as this code? I mean, phase 1 was well understood and started to be integrated into what people are doing. Are you seeing changes in behaviour, positive moves, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. There are several, but there are two that I would highlight, most palpably. The first one is around information sharing. Now, you'll recall when the MPG got together for the first time in New York in January of last year, we were given the list of topics which the FXWG wanted input and content on, and we felt noticeable in its absence from that list was information sharing, because at the time the MPG acutely sensed the paralysis when it came to dissemination of market colour because of all the investigations. So in May of last year, with the delivery of phase 1, was delivery of guidelines and principles around safe information sharing, and that's already unlocked that paralysis, and information and market colour is flowing much more efficiently than it has done in the past, and that's a major step in the right direction. It's key to the efficient functioning of the market. So that's one very palpable benefit. And secondly, we've kind of already mentioned it, and that's these disclosure statements is becoming much more common practice for market participants to explain how they operate, their terms and conditions. And at the heart of the code is transparency. That's a huge step in the right direction. And again, to the point I made before about bilateral discussions, the code absolutely gives market participants the framework for requesting, or in some cases challenging, for more transparency if they're not comfortable with what they see and observe from other market participants. So I think there are a couple of very palpable benefits. And then in terms of adherence, I think now that the code is alive and public, then the gentle but healthy peer pressure of seeing a few market participants sign their statement of commitment will clearly mean that momentum shifts towards demonstrating the adherence. So I think there are a few palpable positives already.
Very good. Any comments before we move? I'm conscious of the time, so I think you've taken some questions, but anything you want to add on that sort of what you've seen so far in the market, changes over the last 12 months?
Adrian nicked my example. So I think information sharing is actually is an obvious one. I've used that a few times today already. I think that's one very clear outcome from what we put out
Yeah.
12 months ago. I suppose the other point which I would make, which is sort of related to that, and it's the discussion point. I mean, I think we somewhat underestimated the benefit of getting a bunch of people around the table and thrashing out some of these issues with the range of perspectives that were present around the table, and that I think that spilled over into the market as a whole. I think some of those conversations and allows it to move to a better place. I mean, one of the greatest benefits I think is ensuring a common understanding of what good practice is, which wasn't there before. People had their own views as to what good market practice was, and in often cases they were fairly aligned, but in some cases not so much. And I think one of the main benefits of this is setting out that collective judgment from a broad range of market perspectives as to what constitutes good practice in the market, and that allows those conversations to happen in a much more effective way than they may have in the past.
We had a round table tour de table at the Global Foreign Exchange Committee yesterday. We asked all of the regional committees to report back on their activities of the year, and I think one of the most common themes was the process of developing the global code had made all of the regional committees to think about their composition and membership.
Yep.
And a very positive side effect has been those committees are becoming more representative of the market as a whole, as everyone appreciates the benefit of bringing greater diversity of view to have these collective discussions about market structure and market development. So the FX committees themselves have been changed by the process of developing the code, and this recognition that kind of thoughtful dialogue about what good practice means can help us come up with better guidance.
And that, of course, will continue with the global FXC
Yes.
on an ongoing basis. So I think we've probably moved to some questions now from the floor. We have got some microphones. First question in here from, if you perhaps give your name and where you're from would help everybody as well. So, though I know who you are. Of course.
Thank you. My name's Bridget Taylor. I'm the MD for ACI. Just congratulations to everybody. I think it's been a superb effort with regards to both the private and the public sector. I'm sure that you're all fatigued. However, the question that I'm asking is just in terms of the longer term, Guy mentioned earlier, with regards to the evolution of the code. The one part of the code that is specific around FX with regards to execution. I just want to get a little bit of understanding what the forward thinking is with regards to including other asset classes under execution, because the other general themes seem to cover almost every aspect of market behavior, but that is one that is specific.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we were tasked with the not so narrow as it was exercise of dealing with the FX market, but it is, you're right, it's relevant, relevant for other asset classes. And I mean, James has a perspective on this, and that some of the stuff that we've got on other aspects of the code is obviously very relevant across all FIC markets. I suppose around execution is where the idiosyncrasies pop up across the other FIC markets. And those idiosyncrasies are not just relevant to the asset class, they're actually different across the globe. And you know, if I take fixed income as the most obvious one, you know, even sovereign debt management practices differ across jurisdictions in a way which has a material effect as to what might constitute good practice in terms of execution. And so I'm happy for that challenge to be landed with someone else. I mean, it was big enough. It's sorting that one out. But that said, there are in each jurisdiction, you have your Treasury Market Practices Group. Other jurisdictions have, it's addressed here through the MFSB, at least amongst other things. But I suppose, I mean, at the moment, I think we've demonstrated, make the high point, that we've demonstrated this sort of public-private sectors working together can actually come up with something. Obviously yet to be fully tested, but nevertheless you can actually use this sort of process to come up with something which I think is worthwhile. And I suppose that does mean that if the need arose, it is possible to do something similar across those other asset classes.
If I might come in here, I think there's a good reason that there's a global code for foreign exchange markets, and I think that will remain the sole global code. But it provides guidance on many aspects which are common to other FIC markets. And if you think about in the UK context, that's guidance that the FIC Market Standards Body can draw upon as it develops its own guidelines. Recently, we came out in the UK of a UK money market code, which replaced the sterling, the money market bit of the NIPS code, and the precious metals code will be published, replacing the precious metals bit of the NIPS code. And they all draw upon the the guidance in the FX code, supplementing it with those bits of guidance mainly on execution, which are relevant for those specific markets. So I do not think this global FX code will assume or consume other asset classes, but it can be used in relevant jurisdictions as a helpful input. And I think a good test of the strength of its guidelines is the extent to which that happens.
So we can all learn from each other. We can have it through one code, or we could read other codes. The Fair and Effective Markets Review I found incredibly helpful in New York, looking at all the great work into that, and that helped us think through stuff for the Treasury Market Practices Group.
Yeah, very good. Any other questions? From, knowing the sun is shining and you're moments away from a beer. But,
I'm moments away from a 24-hour flight. So.
You get a beer?
Yeah.
have a beer first. There we go.
Hi, I'm Stefania Spezzati from Bloomberg News. I'm a reporter. So I was wondering, because banks are already busy with a lot of regulation, there is MiFID coming, and some, there are many rules that they are, trying to apply. So what are your expectations for them to, apply this code? And if you have like a kind of an estimate of cost of for them, what will take for them to apply this code, and or if you are giving practical suggestions to the banks to how to implement the code quickly and in a cheap way.
I mean, you maybe answer it from your own perspective.
No, exactly. So, with respect to time frame, I speak under your control, but the current thinking is the mean time of signing statements of commitment is somewhere between 6 and 12 months. It's fair to say that certain segments of the market will be perhaps further ahead and more advanced in adjusting operating practices because some firms have been through, or some market participants have been through remediation and so are further advanced in transformation of the business. Others are embarking on that relatively recently. Okay, so. But on average, the mean is between 6 to 12 months. Now, in terms of cost, very, very difficult for me to speak on behalf of the industry. And again, it goes back to the point about proportionality. What I will say though on the point about doing it cheaply to mention your words, I understand the point. The cost of getting conduct wrong, and I feel particularly qualified to talk about this today, is immense. One cuts corners at one's peril. But it is going to be very much about proportionality and the size of the business, which will dictate how intrusive the surgery is or the transformation is. I didn't actually properly answer the point about auditing before. Because it's very relevant in the context of cost. Now, the MPG's adherence workstream did reach out to a number of independent consultants to see whether they would be prepared to kind of put their name to an independent audit. And the numbers that came back were, we felt, as an MPG adherence stream, prohibitively expensive for perhaps many, if not all, smaller market participants. So to Chris's point, we didn't put that forward as the best practice, getting independent auditing, because we felt it might exclude a number of market participants who couldn't afford the cost. But there's there are a number of different mechanisms for embedding the code in practices. Obviously, training staff is a very, very important part of that. Certainly in the experience of BNP Paribas, which I'm happy to talk about, we've done extensive training, 700 staff globally on our own internal principles and guidelines, which have been fully aligned to the global code. So, I think that's how I would.
reframe it slightly in the sense, I think most, if not all, market participants have already been evolving their practices in the direction that we've articulated in the code over the last few years. So there's been this direction of change already. So I think there's a large part of it is about verification around that, which is a different thing than a complete realignment of one's business. The other point I would make, and we alluded to it earlier around the information sharing, I think my expectation is this allows the market to function better, which is an important point to make. Certainly not worse, let me put it that way. But in all likelihood better, and I think the information sharing is an example where that was absolutely the case. So that's actually beneficial. So that's not a cost, that's a benefit. So I don't think framing it in terms of cost is actually is the right way to go about it. Or you can take Adrian's point in the cost-benefit calculus. In some cases, is pretty damn obvious. But it is a case that this is businesses just ensuring that their practices are aligned with this. I think that's a different situation from some of the other things I think you're alluding to.
So the three of us here have to do this as well.
Yeah.
We have to go through our businesses and check we're adhering to those 55 principles in a proportionate way. That will take some resources. We should be doing it. We want to be responsible members of the FX market, as everyone does here. So give some resources to this. We'll end up with a better FX market, and it'll be better for us, but most importantly for the people all over the world who rely on an efficient FX market.
A couple of questions over here, again.
Morgan MacDonald, President, ACI UK. I'd also like to echo the congratulations on what you've done so far. I think it's fantastic. Just one question. In relation to the code being voluntary, and we know we have to prescribe to the code, would it be fair to say that central banks will be very critical of multinationals and buy-side that use institutions that haven't signed up to the code?
We'll be critical of our counterparties who haven't signed up to the code, in the sense we'll actually stop dealing with them. No, I mean, I don't. I mean, we're not in the. I mean, we're promoting this. I'm not sure that we're promoting it. We're promoting it in the positive sense. I'm not sure that we'd be in. I don't expect we're in the business of calling out people in the negative sense. It's very much. I mean, as I said, but the parts over which we have direct control and can set the example is with our own counterparties and with our own central bank sponsored foreign exchange committees. So that will set a standard which we would then expect to be promulgated through the market. But I think it's by setting that standard is the way we're going about it.
But perhaps a way of answering your question, and beyond what Guy has said, is we would hope to persuade the types of firms you're talking about the benefits to them of making sure their counterparties adhere to the code. And there is strong self-interest in dealing with counterparties who have made those statements.
We've all been quite public with the benefits of the code. I think we will continue to be. If we feel there are participants, as a class, who aren't seeing those benefits, we'll be out there trying to communicate those benefits again.
I think there's one more behind you there, Sarah. Thanks.
Thank you. It's Nicola Tavendale for Profit and Loss. I just wondered if the panel could explain a little bit more about the practicalities of creating a global register and how you avoid that becoming a burden and essentially dead in the water, and instead make sure that a living key part of a thriving FX market. And how long do you expect that to take to develop?
So I'll take this. We've been discussing the idea of developing registers through the adherence work stream that both the central banks and private sector in recent months, and we judged that firms would find it valuable to be able to post their statements of commitment to these registers. We discussed this again at the Global Foreign Exchange Committee yesterday, and I think one of the kind of strongest pieces of consensus from the private sector firms there was they saw real value in registers being developed. Now, this is a global business with many different market segments, so there can be no single register where all statements of commitments can be posted. And the model we have alighted upon is that the GFXC will put out relatively soon 4, 5, 6 principles that we think define the characteristics of a public register. They're fairly straightforward. I won't enumerate them then because I want to leave something for 2 months' time, but they would not surprise you when you saw them. And we are pretty confident when that has happened, the organisations will come forward and established registers will start getting populated. The idea of the global index, which we will house presumptively on the global FXC website, is a one-stop shop where you can go and see where all those registers are. There may or may not be some functionality, search functionality on that website. That's something which needs to be resolved, which creates slightly more of a burden. But the idea is single place where you can go see where the registers are, click on the register most relevant for you, and then see who signed that statement of commitment. So I don't think it's an undue burden, but the clear message I took from the meeting we had yesterday is real reinforcement. The market will see value in being able to use registers.
We've probably got time for one more question, if there is one, before we then just move perhaps to a few closing statements, or giving the panel warning for a few thoughts as we finish. Anything? Anyone else? No. Just get the so everyone can hear from the back.
Just a last one. With regards to the discussion around costs for all of this, if you look at it, maybe Adrian, you can answer this. In the bigger scheme of things, hopefully at some point it becomes something that's valuable enough that the cost of your CVA requirements or your operational risk mitigate the cost of implementing this type of regulation or ethical conduct. Do you think that that is something that we can expect down the line, or something that, with registers and things where people's names are attached to committing to these types of codes of ethical conduct, surely there's a value to that supersedes the initial investment in terms of ensuring that your behaviour and ethical conduct of your staff is overseen?
Sure, I'm not sure I can answer the first bit about the impact on CVA going forward and what have you. But I think there's definitely strong commercial incentive to embracing this new conduct framework for a whole host of reasons. Most importantly, because of the positive message of assurance that it sends to other market participants. You can engage with me because I think about the world in the same way that you do. I have the same conduct standards, and I think that's a very strong message. And I would fully expect that the statement of commitment, i.e. the fact that you've signed it, becomes an important parameter into the input for selection of your counterparties. So I think there's a very strong commercial incentive to do this, over and above, the message of assurance, and which is a powerful message in and of itself.
Okay, one question, then closing statements. I think. Just wait for the microphone if you could. Thanks.
Matej Roska from S&P Global Market Intelligence. I think what the question was earlier, do you expect to be fined a bit less for FX transgressions once you start adhering to this code quite religiously?
Today's about the forward-looking. Today's really about the future, and not really about so much what may have happened in the past. We have to put our hand up and acknowledge what's happened in the past. It's regrettable, but we move on. There's a reason we're here. There's a reason why the desire to write the code was born. And there's a reason we've all spent, weekends and long nights and hours contributing to it, because it's the right thing to do.
Guy, any final thoughts from you?
No, it's very much related to what Adrian just said, actually, which is this, and going back to what your very first question, was this endeavour was very much about the collective desire, both on the public and the private side, to move the market to a better place so that it does actually function more effectively, and because trust is absolutely central to the effective functioning of financial markets, be they FX or any other asset class. And there was a deficit of trust in this industry, and that needed to be redressed, and we regard this as a way of redressing that deficit of trust and moving the market to a better place, and thereby improving its function. And that collective will was there both on the public and the private side. And just to pick up on what Adrian was just saying, the demonstration of that is that everyone on this on the group, both on the central banking side and the private side, was doing this above and beyond their daily responsibility. So we all still had our day jobs, and then this was, in my literally, in my case, the night job. And the willingness to devote that time and effort to come up with something like this was just a very concrete reflection of that desire and that recognition that the market needed to move to a better place. And that's what this is really all about. This is something designed to benefit the market, improve its functioning for all participants in the market, and have greater confidence in the effective functioning of that market going forward.
Simon, anything to?
So I'd also like to thank all the market participants, both on the MPG and who sent in all the comments from the various FXCs. I'd like to thank some of the people whose day job it was, Jamie Pfeiffer, and some of the people who work for the New York Fed and throughout this audience. There are people from the central banks who managed to produce this code in 2 years. And it's a very good piece of work. I hope you all read it. And I'd just like to thank them for all that work, which was a lot of weekends, a lot of early mornings, and a lot of dedication, but also skill from working on best practices. And I think going forward, that skill and best practices that we've got from this, I think Adrian pointed out, will allow us to evolve this code in a way that keeps up with a very dynamic market.
So I'm going to add to Simon's thanks for the work of everyone over the past 2 years, and then just finish with the observation. We have created a code which is a tool for market participants to improve the integrity of the market. But now it's really over to market participants to show leadership. And I say this particularly to London-based market participants, given the size of our market, and embed and embrace the code and realise its benefits. But people have to do that step.
Any more from you, Adrian, before we wrap up?
Sure. I mean, thanks to the FXWG, but also to my colleagues on the MPG, since I'm representing the MPG today. They put in a huge shift during this process, and the output, I think, has been fantastic. No doubt, some individuals will think we haven't got the temperature right on every single topic. Be that as it may, I think what we can say with great pride and great confidence is the industry today takes delivery of a very, very credible set of principles and guidelines which will evolve.
So from my side, I'd like to thank Guy, Simon, Chris, and Adrian for this evening, for the openness of this conversation, which I think is sort of in the spirit of the whole code in the way in which it's been developed. And also to congratulate the leads, including David Puth, who had to fly back to the States, who obviously led the MPG very effectively and well. So congratulations to getting the code out today. And thank you very much for all your time this evening and the openness. And please join us for a drink afterwards. Thank you very much.